Today we have in our studio Anjali Dua. She grew up in France and has family roots in Calcutta. Now she lives in Arlington, Massachusetts. After completing graduate studies at MIT and launching her career in urban planning, she found her true call in storytelling and writing. She is already at work on her second novel set in the 19th century Lucknow. Her first novel, Faint Promise of Rain, will launch next month here in Boston. It is set in the 16th century of India. Anjali, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. We are so happy to have you here.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Exactly. So let us first start with you grew up in France, right?
I did.
And you moved to Boston when you were 18 years old.
For college.
So let's first talk about the first 18 years. Okay.
Gotta cram it in.
Okay. Yes.
So the first 18 years, well, my mother is actually from Boston, from Brookline. And my father is from Calcutta. I know I'm supposed to say Kolkata, but it's always Calcutta for me.
I'm quite used to Calcutta. I don't call Kolkata.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and they actually met in Cambridge. My father was at MIT. He's a physicist. My mother had just finished college at Radcliffe. And
so where do they live?
so they live in France now.
France, okay.
But they started out to get their life together here in the Boston area. And then after they had children, I was the second one. I have an older brother. They moved to France, and it was supposed to be just for 1 year. It was.
And which year was that?
1973.
1973.
Yeah, I was just a few months old. So what was supposed to be 1 year got extended to 2 years, and then my father got
By the way,
position there.
you have just disclosed your age right now.
I know. I
Okay.
thought of that. Huh?
Okay.
It's all right. I'm all right with it.
Okay.
So then my father got a permanent offer for a permanent position in France for the French government, actually. And so there they are, still there now.
Is he still working there? Still,
Well, yeah, I mean, he's technically retired, although in the sort of science academic world, you can have this emeritus status.
Sure.
He's never actually going to stop
Okay.
thinking about his equations.
Excellent. What about your brother?
He's a journalist in New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
Works for which newspaper?
Freelance.
Freelance, huh?
Yeah.
Excellent. So, what brought you to Boston 18 years later?
Well, so I did my whole high school in France. But in France, what happens when you graduate from high school is that you have to choose right away, what field you're going to go into. And then you go to pursue your studies in that field, medicine or law or economics or whatever it is. But I mean, what 17-year-old really knows what they want to do? And because I had a connection to the U.S., I knew there was this allure of the whole liberal arts college education where you could try things out. I mean, that's what it's all about. You try things out and you don't have to really make a decision. So luckily I was able to get partial scholarship, and so I applied to colleges in the U.S. And I only applied to the East Coast because I only knew the East Coast from visits to my grandparents. California would have doubled the distance from my parents, and other parts of the U.S. just seemed foreign to me.
So you came to which college did you?
I went to Rhode Island. I went to Providence.
To Providence.
To Brown University.
Brown University.
Yeah.
Excellent. Now this is the book, right?
That's
Which
the
is
book.
coming out officially next month.
I know, although I just heard today that it's in bookstores already.
Excellent. Now let us talk about how did you get into writing?
It was a very circuitous journey. I mean, so my mother's a writer. And her father was
what type of writer?
Well, some fiction, although not published yet in terms of fiction. And she has a nonfiction book published in, I don't remember the exact year. I'm thinking 91? No, after that. Anyway, it's called Dharma's Daughters, about sort of the condition of Indian women.
Did she spend some time in India?
She did. She traveled a lot to India with my father, with us as little kids. I think her first trip to India actually was without my father because he couldn't make it. And she ended up in Calcutta in 1975 with 2-year-old and an 8-year-old, and that was her first introduction
Okay.
to India. But then we lived there for a couple of years. She did a lot of research at that time. So she was a writer, and she is a writer, and my grandfather, her father, is a poet. And there's a lot of writers in the family, but it never really was something I decided to do. I enjoyed writing. I got compliments on my writing, essays in school.
You said you did some freelance work before.
Yeah,
right?
so then I actually have a degree in urban planning. That was my career focus.
Sure.
But then I was doing a lot of work internationally, a lot of travel, doing water infrastructure systems. And at a certain point, I knew I wanted children, and the whole travel, job with a lot of travel wasn't going to be realistic.
So how many kids you have?
I have 2.
2 sons, daughters?
2 daughters.
2 daughters. How old are they?
They are 4 and 10.
4 and 10.
Yeah.
Are they somewhere in this novel?
They are not as people in this novel, but I do think that my writing changed somehow as a result of having children and watching them like little characters developing. Interestingly, interestingly to me at least, the main character in this book is a girl who was born at the start of the book, and actually when I was about 3 chapters into writing, I found out that I was pregnant with what would end up being our first daughter. And so there was sort of a parallel of the main character in this book and my own older child.
Well, we don't want you to give out the secrets of the book, but if you can tell us, I like the title, Faint Promise. So, Faint Promise, and then there's an element of rain. So just tell us about the title part of the book.
The title was honestly the hardest thing about writing the book. I had the completed manuscript, and I was about to send it to agents, and I didn't have a title yet. And I tried out various things, and it just didn't happen. And finally I said to myself, I think the title is in the book. It's already there. I just need to find it. And so I reread the manuscript, every word, looking for the title, and then I found it. This phrase is in the story.
So what it tells, like
well, how do you tell me? What does it tell?
Well, I'm just asking. I'm very curious about just the title.
Well, the story takes place in Rajasthan,
Okay.
and honestly, the impetus for writing the story came from this one image in my head. We were about to travel to Rajasthan. I had been there as a child, but now I was bringing my husband.
Sure.
First trip to India, and I wanted him to go to Rajasthan because it's so magical and beautiful. Yeah. And I was looking at a guidebook. This tells you how long ago it was because I wasn't looking online. I was looking at a guidebook, and there was this little quote or something. It was an image. It said that in Rajasthan, it's possible for a 5-year-old child to never have seen rain in certain parts of Rajasthan. And that in the palaces of in the children's rooms of royal palaces, what they would do is they would paint all around the wall and the ceiling, they would paint designs of black clouds.
Sure.
So that when it did actually rain, the children wouldn't be afraid. And that really stuck with me, this idea that you could have grown that old and not have ever seen rain. And so there's definitely a motif of rain in my book. The first rain in 5 years takes place at the start of the book.
And where is the setting of the book?
It's in Jaisalmer.
Okay.
Yeah, in Rajasthan.
Rajasthan, yes.
Yeah, far
so,
out.
So, what was the first
desert.
time you traveled to do your first recollections and memories of Rajasthan?
I was 12. We were living in India for a couple of years. I was going to school, and we were in Bombay. And I was going to school there. And any time I had a school vacation, my parents and my brother was already in college, but my parents and I would go on a trip, explore some other part of India. So we went to Rajasthan. And we went to Jaisalmer, which at the time you couldn't fly to. You had to take a train, and it was long. And I just remember the sense of this magical, beautiful city just kind of rising up from the desert, all kind of the same colors of orange and yellow, and almost like a mirage, and the sense of being there and the images of being there really stuck with me.
Now, my question to you is that, like, first 18 years literally you spent in France, and after that, in one place where we stayed for the longest time has been Boston or Boston suburbs.
Yeah.
And your visits to India has been very frequent, not for a very long time. So in that context, the title, the first book theme is set in India.
Mm-hmm.
The second book you were writing is also set in India. So what is the reason that why you keep going back to India?
Well, so this is actually the first of what I plan to be a 4-book set, not a series, but a set that fits together, a quartet.
Sure.
And they're all, what links them all is they're all related to the history of Kathak dance. And I started just around the time of that trip, I told you, with my husband to Rajasthan. I started studying Kathak here in the Boston area. And something all came together. I started learning about the history of the dance and how one lineage, one school goes back to Rajasthan. And I had these images, very vivid images in my mind of Jaisalmer.
Yeah.
And I started studying this dance, which itself is a storytelling form of dance with a very long and rich history. And as I started looking into the history of the dance, I realized that the history of Kathak has sort of paralleled the history of India for, at least the past 1,000 years. And every time there was some major upheaval, sort of socio-political upheaval in India, like the arrival of the Mughals or, the arrival of the British and then the departure of the British, there's been a similar shift in Kathak in not only the style of the dance, but who's dancing and for whom and in what context and why. And so each of these 4 books is set, one is set, the next 3 will be set,
Sure.
at one of these critical periods of upheaval in India's history, which, like I said, is mirrored in the history of Kathak.
Now, I know it's going to be a tough thing to ask you, but I just want you to read a few lines from this book here, which I think is favorite. If you can find that faint promise part, that will be fantastic. If not, then
that I don't know.
But anything, whatever you think that is really interesting, just one brief paragraph and say.
Okay.
Sure.
I will do that. Let's see.
Which somehow touches, your...
I'm not going to read the first one. I know which one I'm going to read. It's actually the beginning of chapter 2.
Okay.
Tell me when to stop.
Okay, no, just one paragraph, and
Okay.
I will.
Well, then if it's one paragraph, I'll do the first. Not the prologue, but the first chapter. For 5 long years, the rains had failed to come. For months, my brother Mahendra had watched the lake's water level drop far below the steps that used to lead into it from the sandy path, leaving ever smaller brown rings along the shore. The grasses in the temple courtyard crackled in the wind, yellow and brittle. Within 2 days of being painted, decorative designs on the outer walls of the scattered huts, made with a paste of white lime, flaked off and blew away. And out beyond the city limits, where Mahendra often sought refuge from what he felt were his burdens, even the camels swayed languorously over the hazy dunes, dragging their feet across the searing sand as their drivers ut-uted them in irritation, eager to set up camp in the cold relief of night.
Thank you. So now I see that, you have a brother, and then, I see that, you
true.
pick up that thing, the brother. So how, and also you said that your father was born in India, in Calcutta, and
Yep.
grew up there and then moved
Yep.
here. So just tell me about growing up in a family where you have father is Indian, mother is American, and then you were born in France. So how it was, and how anything which really was striking, which you think about your father or mother, and tell us about that.
So I always joke with people that I have 3 halves. I'm half French, and I'm half American, and I'm half Indian. I am actually not. I don't have any French blood. But having spent all my formative years there, I do feel to a certain extent French. I went through the entire French education system up through high school, and so I feel like as a child I was always somehow an outsider in any of these places while also being an insider.
Yeah, sure.
And so people were often a little confused. They still are now. They think they figured out my 2 sides, and then they realize there's a third one. So in France, people thought of me as American because the French have this obsession with America, sort of a love-hate thing. But they thought it was cool
Sure.
that I was American, even though I speak French without any accent.
What about Bengali? Did you pick up?
Unfortunately, no. I understand.
Bengali, any Indian language? or
I know.
Hindi?
This is why I have to say to my father, I wish you taught me Bengali. Because, and I don't know why.
That's
it
what I
was.
tell my kids. So one day you're going to ask us
I
that,
know.
why didn't you teach?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if it was maybe because my parents themselves, when they moved to France, they didn't speak French.
Sure.
And so for them, they were already trying to assimilate a whole new language and culture. And we spoke English at home. I don't think it was necessarily something that struck my father that he should speak Bengali also when he himself was just trying to get his, bearings in French. But I do wish that I...
But glad you learned a dance at least.
Yes, there's that. Now I speak the language of the dance.
Okay. So let's come back to the growing up in that.
So there was always this inside-outside feel, I would come to the U.S. and people thought I was American. I sound American. But I didn't have any idea of sort of the pop culture references or all that. To me was foreign. And then when I traveled to India, it was interesting too. I had, a whole Indian family there, and we would go home to our home in Calcutta, and the people who worked for my grandmother had seen me since I was a baby. But the thing is, I look like this. I don't look that Indian.
Yeah,
I got
absolutely.
mostly the Western genes.
Sure.
So that was also sort of baffling for people, and I don't speak Bengali. But I could understand a fair amount.
Okay.
So, to me, this was actually, I think that contributed to being a writer, because I feel like wherever I was, I always kind of looked at things from the outside. And not in an uncomfortable way. I was sufficiently comfortable in all these environments that I didn't feel, awkward or out of place. But it gave me a different perspective. And I think that probably helped in terms of becoming a writer.
In terms of coming back to your writing career, when was the first time you thought, I should start writing my experiences? Because you seem to have a very unique experience too.
Yeah, I wrote my experiences as a kid in a journal, those little journals with the little lock and...
Do you still
keys.
write the journal?
I don't. For one thing, it's just a matter of time. I mean, I for a while I was doing freelance projects, researching my book. I have 2 young children. Not much time to do other stuff.
So what percentage in this book is fiction and what percentage is, some real life experiences?
None of them are my own real life experiences.
Yeah, sure.
But they are, the setting is historical. The location and the relative distances between things. What was happening during that time is real, is history. The book is set just at the start of when Akbar comes to the throne at the age of 13. And so the background, the political and historical background is all, true. But the characters are all made up. The characters are made up to tell, a story I wanted to tell.
The one thing I'm getting is that your interest in history, because the first book is, has all these spices, I should say. And then the next book which you are writing, it is also set in the 16th century Lucknow. That's also it. So tell us about your fascination with history.
Well, part of it is it came from my interest in the history of Kathak. But I guess I've always been interested to some extent.
And Kathak
in history.
is storytelling in a
right,
way, right?
Exactly,
Sure.
exactly. I don't know if it's an interest in history or so much in the stories that lead up to the present moment. What has gone into creating what we have now.
How much time did you spend in writing this book from day one? Or when the idea came to your head?
Well, I'll say 10 years.
10 years.
If I had been doing only this, it would have been much less.
Sure.
But I was working. I had my first child, then my second child. And honestly, for the first couple of years, I didn't allow myself to take too much time. I didn't really realize that
So
this
bulk
is what
of
I
the
was
work
doing.
was done how long? 2 years ago? 3 years ago?
It was very spread out because I did a lot of the research, 2003, 2004, most of the research. And then, by 2008, I had a full draft. I started taking workshops as a great local writing group, Grub Street Writers. I started doing some classes there and having other people read my work, getting feedback.
So now, if there is a new writer who wants to write something,
Mm-hmm.
could be a small novel or book,
Mm-hmm.
what are the advice you will give? Like, say 3 advices you will give that if you really want to write a book, this is what, since
Mm-hmm.
with your own experience, these
Yeah.
are the things you need to do.
So 3 things. One thing is I would say you need to write whatever it is you want to write. There's no point in trying to figure out, this topic is hot right now or people will be interested in such and such. You have to be really true to yourself and to what you care about. That's the only way you're going to write a really strong
Sure.
book, story, whatever it is. The second is then to make it as good as you can possibly make it, to take the time, to not be in a rush to get it out there, to take the time to get advice, to hone your craft, to take classes, to edit, to learn how to edit if you need to learn how to edit.
Did you take any writing class?
I ended up taking a bunch of sort of workshop type classes
Was that
here
helpful?
in Boston. It was very helpful. And partly what it was helpful for was actually getting the feedback from people. You write your own thing. You're so in your own head. You have no idea, really. Is it good? Is it conveying what I want to convey? Is it something that people want to read? You need to get that outside validation.
So that's point number 1. Point number 2.
There were 2
Okay,
points.
2. Okay, so let's.
But the first was to write what you want.
Okay.
The second was to write it as well as you can.
Okay.
And the third is to be really open to what's going on in the publishing industry right now. There's a huge amount of change. The whole publishing industry is going through a tumultuous time where the old traditional model of a big publishing house with big fancy offices on some expensive piece of real estate in New York City, publishing your book and sending you on a book tour and all this thing, it's not happening now. Certainly not for a new writer. But on the flip side is there are some great opportunities to get your writing out there if you're just open-minded and somewhat entrepreneurial.
So how did you find the publisher for this book? How did you publish this book?
So I have an agent, and I found my agent at a writing conference run by the same organization I mentioned, Grub Street Writers. And we were sitting at the same table, and I chatted with her, and she wanted to see the manuscript. She loved it. So she represents me, and she helped me find the publisher, which is actually a fairly new and smaller publisher, and therefore I think sort of more nimble, more able to kind of go with the times than some of the more
In
traditional
terms
ones.
of writing, like if I'm a new writer, what should be my first major focus? Should be that how well I write, or should be the theme, the idea, or both?
Well, I mean, the very first one should be the theme or the idea, because it should be something that gets you really excited and motivated to write.
Sure.
And once you're convinced of that you're writing what you want to be writing, then you go on to point number 2, which is, do everything you can within your means, the resources you have to make it as strong as possible.
Now, I hear that already we started to work on the second book,
Mm-hmm.
And that is set in Lucknow.
It is.
So how did you come across that theme? And
So that is sort of what I see as the second big shift in sort of the story of Kathak. So this book takes place at a time when, just at the beginning of the Mughal Empire, and there's this fear of what's going to happen to the Hindu temple dancers if the area falls under sort of Muslim rule. And the story here is how this family, each member somewhat differently, deals with this little girl at the center. So the next story takes place at the tail end of the Mughal Empire, right in Lucknow, which was one of the last Nawab of Lucknow, Wajid Ali Shah. His was one of the last kingdoms to sort of fall to the British. But it was also, Lucknow was a seat of Kathak and a lot of arts,
absolutely.
right? So
You know,
poetry and music.
Bollywood has done a great job in coming up with some really great movies based on Kathak dance.
Yeah.
Have you watched any of those movies?
I
or
haven't
no?
watched the Bollywood ones. I
Okay.
did see, I've seen Umrao Jan.
Umrao, yeah, that's
Yeah,
beautiful.
the
That's a very-
Muzaffar Ali one is particularly strong. I know there's a couple of versions. But for me, what I think I'm bringing that's different is I always like to focus on. I'm always curious about the people who don't fall into very specific categories, and maybe that's because of my own background.
Sure.
And so, in my next book, there is a courtesan, but she's somebody who feels she doesn't really belong, and she's struggling with her place. And she has a son who is half French, because she had him with a French engineer. And so her son ends up being not only not Indian and not only not British, but also not Anglo-Indian, which was
Sure.
a defined category,
Sure.
because he's Franco-Indian. And so that brings a different perspective. And so the story takes place
So
right
did, like,
around
for example,
this.
when you travel in India,
Mhm.
did this issue come up that, oh, I'm not Anglo-Indian, I'm Franco-Indian? Or
No,
people
because in
didn't.
this day and age, so many people are
didn't.
mixed up.
Yeah.
You know.
When was the last time you went to India, visited India?
I went with the kids 3 years ago.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
So when you go to India, you go to Calcutta or?
Well,
no?
so it's funny you should ask. In the past, yes. But this trip with the children, I didn't like going to India as a child.
Mhm.
Because I was uprooted from everything I was familiar with. And I would get plopped in this household in Calcutta. And everybody loved me, of course. It was very warm.
Sure.
But I felt kind of suffocated. The relatives I didn't know. I saw every few years would come and would pinch the cheeks.
Yes.
And all these boring conversations. And I didn't know what to talk about. If people asked about school, here I was.
And language was another.
Well, everything was in English. All my
Okay.
father's relatives, everything took place in English. But, and I couldn't even get out. I felt confined to the house. If I even said that I wanted to go for a walk, it was like, oh no, we'll go get the lime for you, or we'll go do something. There was always somebody to go do things for me.
Sure.
I didn't want, especially my older child, because she was 6 at the time. My youngest was 9 months, so we just plopped her around wherever. But I didn't want my oldest child to have the same. I wanted her to have an experience which would make her want to return to India.
Mhm.
And so we did the things that I would have liked to do as a child. We went to visit a tea plantation. We went down to Kerala. I had not been to Kerala. We went to Goa. We even stayed in a hotel with a pool, which I don't usually do because
Sure.
I'd rather save the money for other things. But we went riding on elephants. And you know what? She loved it. She wants to go back to India, and for me that means the mission was accomplished. Now that she's older, she can absorb some of the
Your
other
best
things.
childhood memory of India?
My best childhood memory of India was possibly our visit to Rajasthan. I remember going out on a camel out into the Thar Desert. And also some of the friendships I made, not in school. I had a terrible time in school. But we lived in this housing complex that was affiliated with the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research, TIFR, where my father was.
Sure.
And I made some really, really good friends there, one of whom was actually named Kalyani, and my older daughter is named Kalyani.
Did your father ever talk to you about his experience of growing up in India?
I don't think he directly talked about his experience of growing up. Our house was definitely full of Indian classical music. Neither of my parents is religious per se, but they each brought to our family some cultural elements. My mother is of Jewish background, so there was sort of Jewish cultural elements, and then a lot of books on Indian history. My father put on classical music a lot. I wouldn't say that he talked that much about his experience of growing up, except certain tales, the stories that get passed down through the family members about when the family would go off to Darjeeling and to avoid the hot months. Or
Sure.
all this stuff that looks kind of exotic. We have these old sepia-colored photos of my father's family with their Rolls Royces. I mean, now this is like a completely different era.
What
But-
about food? Did you get used to?
Oh yeah, we always ate Indian food. In
Oh.
fact, my mother cooked it a lot.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
she incorporated that. At least once or twice a week we would have Indian food.
What about now?
Now, you know, the problem is,
Do you have any craving once in a while? Or
oh yeah, I do. I don't make it that much myself because I find it's quite time consuming.
Yes, it is.
And you know, my mother worked from she was home with the children. I mean, she did some writing and all, but she was home, and I think she might have I don't know, either she figured out ways to make the meals more quickly, or she had a little more time to do so. But I definitely get cravings for Indian food.
Now, what about your brother? How are you in touch with him very often? Or?
Yeah. He lives in New York. So he comes up to see us often. He really likes spending time with his nieces.
Mm-hmm.
He actually lived in Boston for about 20 years. He came to college in the Boston area.
Okay.
And stayed until about maybe 6.
Now you are, of course, with writings and all, you can see that you are very much immersed into the Indian cultural theme. What about him? What about your brother?
Wouldn't say he's immersed. He's definitely in touch, and he follows certain things. He follows Indian politics even sort of more than I do. And he has, a whole lot of Desi friends and sort of that kind of thing. But he hasn't done a sort of body of work specific to India.
Sure. Now, when you completed your first draft of the book, who was the first person to read it apart from you?
So I did show it to my husband. It was one of the hardest things I've done.
Okay.
For me, I used to be somebody who had a very hard time showing my work to other people, especially people close to me. So the hardest was showing to him and then showing my mother.
Mm-hmm.
My mother didn't see the first draft. I think she saw maybe the third or fourth.
Okay. So what was the reaction of your husband?
I remember very, very vividly. I gave him the manuscript and I said, "You can't read it when I'm in the house. I didn't want to see him reading it and look at his face and all the." And we happened to be about to go to France to visit my parents, and I went ahead with our daughter. We didn't have the second one yet, and I knew. He said, "Oh, great! I'm going to read it on the plane." And so I went ahead and spent some time with my parents, and then he joined us in the south of France. Sure. So you fly to Paris, and then you take a train. So I remember I was standing on the platform of the train station, waiting for his train to come in. And I see him get out. This was a beautiful sunny day, and I see him get out, and he has this horrible look on his face, like he was ill or something. And I said, "Are you okay? Did something happen on the train?" He says, "No, I was reading your book." And then I thought, my God, it's that bad. And then then he realized what he was making me go through. He said, no, I was just so immersed, and he had come to a sort of difficult scene in it, and that's when the train had stopped. And so he had been sort of catapulted back out into the actual world, but was still sort of stuck in that part of the story. And then I thought, okay, well, it seems to be affecting him, so I guess this is a good thing.
So, well, with that, we thank you very much for coming. And it's a really pleasure to meet you, and keep us posted, with your future books.
I will.
And
for sure.
All the best with your next one.
Thank you. Well, if you're interested in this one, I hear the Harvard Bookstore has it on display.
Excellent. Great. And you can, of course, buy it online.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble,
everywhere.
Anywhere. Also ebooks.
Excellent.
Yeah, Kindle, Nook, all that.
Excellent. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.